as you'll see, moving the book signing into the LBC so that the books don't get wet will resonate very well with our panel on the river and the extreme amount of water in this landscape. Hi, my name is Brian Edwards. I'm Dean of the School of Liberal Arts here at Tulane, and I'm thrilled and honored to host this panel with two wonderful New Orleans-based and New Orleans returning or set authors who have fabulous books that come from very different directions onto helping us think about the river, Mississippi River, and all of the many, many issues that emerge from or seep away from that river. Let me first introduce Virginia and Boyce a little bit more fully, and as you'll see, their own journeys to their projects are something that we'll be really interested in talking about. Virginia Hanusik is an artist whose work explores the relationship between landscape culture and the built environment, and she thinks and writes about landscape representation, extraction, and the visual narratives of climate change. As I said, she's returning. She's currently pursuing an MFA in photography at the Rhode Island School of Design. Her new book, Into the Quiet and the Light, Water, Life, and Land Loss in South Louisiana, one of the most beautiful books visually and to hold and to move through that you'll find in the book exhibit. And if it's not sold out now already, because it's in between print runs, you should run at some point without tripping to get it, because it's a beautiful book to hold, to read through. The book features Virginia's photographs, which appear alongside essays and poetry commissioned from various contributors and various communities, including indigenous communities who engage with the river. As a whole, the book explores the cultural legacy of weather and storms in coastal areas, the physical and psychological marks left by hurricanes, and the privileges afforded to certain communities over others in responses to flood damage. And in Virginia's own words, at the core of this project is an effort to encourage thinking of this region and coastal communities around the country as an interconnected system rather than as separate and expendable landscapes. Virginia grew up far from here in the Hudson Valley, although she makes really interesting connections in the book between the ways we've depicted visually, famously in American art more broadly, the Hudson River Valley and this area, but we'll talk about that. And she studied architecture at Bard College. And when she was a student at Bard in 2011, she traveled to Louisiana to take part in a volunteer program that began in the wake of Hurricane Katrina, working on outreach for the Broadmoor Improvement Association, which eventually led to a job with Propeller, a nonprofit where she focused on coastal restoration and water management. So that job took her outside of the city's levee system along the Mississippi toward the Gulf, and the more Virginia drove through this landscape, the more it piqued her curiosity and the more she was compelled to continue exploring. And so we will, as we engage the book, you'll feel that. Now, Boyce Upholt is a nature critic, and a great way of describing the work that he's doing both in his book and more broadly. His writing probes the relationship between humans and the rest of the natural world, especially in the U.S. South. He also grew up far from here in the Connecticut suburbs and holds a bachelor's degree from Haverford College and an MFA from the program for writers at Warren Wilson College. He moved to the Mississippi Delta in 2009, where he discovered an unexpected wilderness amid the agricultural empire, the Mississippi River, which for hundreds of miles offers a corridor of islands and sandbars and wetland forests with no settlement or development. And his fascination with the river began while canoeing, with a canoeing expedition exploring its island and back channels. And as you read his remarkable book, his ability to think about the river from on it or in canoes is really one of the many things that distinguishes it for me as an approach to engaging with this incredible body. In his words, he felt he was in a separate world. This place was windswept and water blasted, composed of curling lines. It was not a typical wilderness, perhaps, but it was as wild a place as I've ever been. his ensuing obsession with how this wild place came to persist, despite so much change in engineering, inspired a wider interest in the strange nature of nature itself, this thing that we call separate but really are a part of. Boyce's work ranges from the straightforward journalism and science writing to travel writing that invites readers to better connect with the more than human world. And as you can tell, as we move to our guests, what I'd like to do with our conversation with these two remarkable artists is not only to think about the river and water and the way that we engage with and live with water and nature and the environments that we have both live with and change, which they show us so much about how to think about, but to think about how we depict and write and photograph and represent, because it's really a wonderful benefit to have you both here together. But let's start by the fact, and I emphasized it, of course, I underlined it because I too grew up far from here and have called this place my home for the last 7 years and am obsessed with it. But how you came to these projects, because I should say, many of our great authors at this weekend have produced, so many books and moved from one project to another, and you guys will continue to do that. But these are projects, as you read them, they've been working on for a really long time, and they're bigger than the books themselves. I mean, they've been obsessed with. They're passion projects in a way. And so, Virginia, I'd love to start with you, and then Boyce, about how you kind of came to this project beyond what I've just said about your life.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for having me and for everyone who's organized this festival and for that really warm introduction. So the book took a really long time to make, and it was something that, as you had mentioned, moved here in 2014, I was in very much of an exploratory discovery phase of the work and didn't pursue photography as a career after college. It kind of was something that organically I started doing as I was visiting all of these places throughout South Louisiana, doing the work that I was engaged in at the nonprofit that I was working at the time. So it kind of became this me trying to contextualize my own life and where I had moved to, and thinking about a landscape that's so entirely different from the one that I grew up in terms of elevation and topography and the architecture, obviously. So it was very much like an investigative process for me. And over time, as I began becoming more involved in a lot of the climate work that was going on here, and working with a lot of different communities, both in terms of like actual water management plans, but also in a larger context around climate justice, the project kind of became something that took 10 years to make and figure out, and I'm really interested in what Boyce has to say about the development of their work as well, because the book that I made and came out last year was not something that would have been possible 2-3 years into when I had started working on it. And a lot of that has to do with the relationships that I've made with people, and that being such a core component to the book itself and my own practice as an artist in terms of collaboration and really wanting to figure out ways to incorporate different voices into the photography work that I do. Yeah.
Yeah, Boyce, I'm going to give you that question. I mean, the temporality and time in making a book and reading a book, and then the ways in which you take a detour and start canoeing every little inlet in order to help us describe it are really remarkable in your work.
Yeah. And so you captured sort of in that intro some of how this project came to be. It was actually, I realized this yesterday, 10 years ago to the month, I had this magazine assignment to write a profile of the canoe guide. So Mississippi Delta in that bio is not the river delta down here, but the alluvial basin right north of Vicksburg, Mississippi. I was living there, and there's this guy named John Rusky who's locally famous, and I'd heard of him, and he takes tourists out on the Mississippi River, which back then, 10 years ago, I thought, isn't it just a big toxic canal? So it seems like a weird job to take tourists out on a big canal. So I pitched a magazine, said, let me write about this, and went out for 3 days and 2 nights, and that line you read is from the intro. I was just like, this is so beautiful, and how have I lived I had been living in Mississippi for 6 years at that point, 20 miles from the Mississippi River, and I didn't know that beautiful wilderness was right there. And I think that's in part because a lot of my neighbors didn't know. I've since, like, when the book came out in June, I went on tour and got to go back to various communities, including the town of Cleveland where I used to live. And people were like, I've lived here my whole life, and we've just been told stories about floods and the danger of the river. And so people don't cross over the levee and see it. So back to, like, our roots not being from down here, I think that, again, I've met plenty of people in Mississippi and Louisiana that do have a relationship with the river, but I don't think it's the norm. And so kind of being an outsider that have been around long enough to call the South the Mississippi River home has, I think, opened up my ability to see it. But yeah, this book took 8 years from that canoe trip until it came out, right? And it was a matter of various things, of, like, even just wrapping my head around, is it possible for me to try and capture the 10,000-year history of the Mississippi River in one book, and how much knowledge I would have to gain to do that was part of what took so long. And also just because I was, a writer just barely beginning when I started this project, and this has been sort of the arc of my career, has been getting this book into the world.
You used the word beauty and whether or not the river is beautiful, and I want to kind of talk about that for a second. I'm going to tell you a one 2-sentence story. Is that when I came down to New Orleans interviewing for the job that I now hold, in fact, I was checking into the hotel down on Poydras Street, and I asked, as you sometimes do when you're checking in, is this room going to be facing, which way is it going to be facing? And I said, could I face the river? I just thought that would be a thing you would do. This was the body of water. You always want to face the body of water. And the guy behind the desk, who was very elegant, he said, why would you want to face that dirty, muddy, disgusting thing? And I was like, well, okay, I guess I've learned something. Don't talk about the river. But Virginia, this book is beautiful, which I've been emphasizing, and I love bookmaking and so on. But you also include, when we talk about the Hudson River, look at this book. But there's these inset, reproductions, and you include, the famous Hudson River School paintings with the mountains and these kind of ideas of sublime landscapes that were part of a different project, let's say, and some of the paintings that were shown here at NOMA not too long ago. You can talk about that exhibit, but can you talk a little bit about beauty, as artists and painters have sometimes thought of, and how you've approached this as an, in a sense, art critic, but then an artist yourself?
Yeah. So I'm interested, just in my upbringing and the place that I grew up in landscape having so much of an impact on how I see the world. Seeing beauty, of course, as a construct, and how the value system that we put on landscapes is so determined by a subjective view. So I grew up in a place that was defined by water, the Hudson River. It's represented in a very different way than a place like the lower Mississippi River Valley. And a lot of that has to do with this continued sense of how we portray landscapes coming over from Europe to America in ways where landscape painters were used to representing and portraying views of a landscape that had a range in topography and elevation and allowed for this beautiful range of light and color, that thinking about when landscape painters and how South Louisiana was represented, it's the complete opposite. It's flat. A lot of inspiration for this book and the introduction that I wrote came from Inventing Acadia, that show that was at NOMA in 2019. And the curator really talks about how when people, colonizers came to Louisiana and seeing this landscape, they didn't know if it was land or water. So they didn't know what to do with it, much less how to paint it as a landscape. And I think that history is really interesting in terms of what places get perpetuated into this American canon of art and what we consider to be beautiful. Certainly the Hudson River Valley, Thomas Cole, Frederick Church, those painters have such a presence in how we talk about the American landscape. And in the West, photographers like Ansel Adams and Carlton Watkins, these are all like sublime, very tectonic, thinking about the earth and its history. And then in a place like here where you don't have that range in perspective, there's a really interesting connection between how we've potentially developed this space for exploitation because it's not in that canon of beauty, how we see it in America and how we define that. So obviously all three of us, and I'm sure many people in this audience, see this place as inherently beautiful. But I think what we're getting at too with what had just been previously said is like this idea of perception and how you think about a place and how that has been visually communicated and how much that impacts how you view and treat the space that you're in. So a lot of the book kind of argues through different essays and in my own introduction that it's not point A to point B in terms of Louisiana being left out of this iconic American landscape art and then the proliferation of the fossil fuel industry here. But I certainly believe that there is a tie to that just because of the ways that we haven't historically seen this place in terms of the value that its beauty possesses.
So let me ask a follow-up on that. When you about the ways in which beautiful landscape work, you mentioned Thomas Cole, Church, and then Ansel Adams in the West for those that are maybe even others. Those are part of the visual iconography of American art, let's say, and people are familiar with those iconic images, let's say. We don't think of them often because people are outside of them as political. There's rarely people in those works, sometimes small in the paintings in the Hudson River School, as political in a sense. How do you think about then, and even share some, it's in your essay, how the politics of some of those images of the sublime or of the landscape could work in terms of federal or state actions?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of examples, and I think one of the more direct ones is in the case of Carlton Watkins surveying the American West and how that was completely tied to land management policies and through federal actual government commissions of his work. So thinking about the ways that politics and art have always been connected and continue to be in terms of how landscape representation is done. Mm-hmm. But also going back to Hudson River School painters and the sublime kind of picturesque European romantic paintings that tradition was founded on. It really created this nation-building American kind of identity that was so tied to separating ourselves from Great Britain and thinking about how the unique American landscape is these ideas of ownership and possession, certainly encouraging manifest destiny and the displacement of indigenous peoples along the way.
I don't know, how many of you have seen this film that I learned about from Virginia, Louisiana Story, 1948 film, nominated for Academy Award. Wow, impressive. Nominated for Academy Award for Best Writing, and now registered as in the archive of by the Library of Congress under the National Film Registry. Can you tell us just for a moment about this film?
Yeah,
it's a still,
so
for those of you who have
it's
excellent
gorgeous.
Air Force-like eyes.
It's beautiful. It's shot in black and white on film, obviously, and it chronicles this Cajun boy and his family as oil drillers kind of come into his family's land and start drilling. And it has a lot of really beautiful shots. It, like you said, had been nominated for an Academy Award. It's just aesthetically a very beautiful film. It was commissioned by the Standard Oil Company, so it's essentially a propaganda film that I found a couple of years ago and was just so mesmerized by it because it is aesthetically just a beautiful way of looking at Louisiana, of seeing the swamps in the light and just having kind of this slice of life moment. But at the same time, it has a very pernicious agenda because of the role that oil companies wanted to continue to this day want to be involved in like the representation and portrayal of a place in order to suit their interests. So,
Boyce, the Mississippi River, and we're going to talk about literature for a little moment, and Mark Twain maybe, or obviously has a profound role in helping us think about the American story. It's been an inspiration for literature, not only Twain's work, a person who renamed himself after a river. Well, you can tell the story, but talk about Mark Twain.
Sure. Yeah, if you don't know the name Mark Twain, right? He was actually Samuel Clemens, and Mark Twain. He worked for just a couple years. It's like a very narrow sliver of his life that he is so important to his biography. But so he worked as a steamboat pilot and came up in that industry, and so. It's basically like moving through, they'd be having to measure the depth, and they'd say Mark 1, Mark 2, and Mark Twain would be, I think, 3 meters. I don't know the precise, but it's basically that term. It's just this call that you would hear out in the river in the 1850s when he was coming up. And he liked the sound of it and needed a pen name, so that's where that came from. Yeah, Twain's a really interesting figure for various reasons. One, I grew up in Hartford, Connecticut, and that's where he ended his life. I grew up kind of going to his beautiful home in Hartford for school field trips, and so this inverse journey of me like winding up on the river and that becoming so essential to my career. I found his writing is so prescient, like everything he wrote 140 years ago, however many years ago, it's still all I find very correct. His thoughts about sort of Teddy Roosevelt, his thoughts about the river and its capacity to be engineered or not. But it relates to, I think, some of what we're talking about how we think about this landscape down here, and that I've come to think of like Huck Finn in particular as almost like an eclipse, a literary eclipse that now obscures our ability to actually think about what the Mississippi River is today. I think most people, again, they think it's if you're pushed to envision the modern Mississippi River, most people, including myself, until I got to know it in a canoe, would have said it's dirty and disgusting. Why would you want your hotel window overlooking at it? And then the secondary set of associations besides engineered and disgusting is like the romance of the steamboat Natchez or the Calliope you can still hear in the French Quarter. And that was just it remains the sort of the text that produced the American novel, right? And so that means in the 100+ years since Huck Finn was published, 140 years, there's so much has evolved, so much has changed, and also so much has stayed the same in terms of it remaining sort of a pristine feeling place in certain places. And it's hard for people to know that because that is such an element of our culture.
Yeah, so let's, of course, Huckleberry Finn, and thinking about the way in which the landscape paintings occlude individuals, and of course, Huckleberry Finn is very much about Huck and Jim, and Twain's work in Life on the Mississippi, takes the Mississippi as its central character, let's say. And I want to talk about your book in this way, telling a history. I was trying to describe to people as I was reading this book, as you do when you're reading a book and people say, what are you reading? What it was and what kind of book it was. And it's a book about the Mississippi River, was one thing I would say. But as I read through it, it was also a book about American history. It was also a book about this region. And if one thinks about works of history, as many of the works that we're discussing in this weekend are organized around individuals, and in taking the river and its history as the focal point, it's a very different way of telling us history of America. So how were you thinking about that as you put together the book?
Yeah, I don't know that I was, but I've been thinking about it this week. Earlier this weekend, I was listening to this really interesting podcast about those books that are like how X changed the world, right? Mark Kurlansky's Cod book, or there's so many of them. And the podcast was like how books about things that change the world. And I could have written this book as how the Mississippi River changed the world, because it did, right? Like it made America, I think. It made our modern vision of who we are as a country is so rooted on the frontier era on the Mississippi River. But that's not the book that I wanted to write. I probably would have sold it better if I had that was the subtitle, Mississippi, the River that changed the world. But I was interested I am interested in understanding where I'm standing all the time. And the landscapes that we live in are layers of culture and history and engineering, and I'm always fascinated about peeling back those layers because I just want to understand where I am. And that's what this book was in many ways. I think I was lucky as an aspiring writer that I found myself canoeing in this landscape that I loved, and then I was like, oh wait, this is one piece of a 1 million+ square mile watershed so it's 40% of the continental US, and it is the heart of much of American history. And so
Look at that map.
Look at that map.
This is his Mississippi River.
Yes,
It's all of that. Right?
Created by my wife, Tulane professor Liz Community. Made beautiful
Okay,
maps for the books.
Shout out. There she is, the one holding her face in shame.
Yeah, it was a blessing as an aspiring writer to find that, like, I like trying to understand where I live, and where I live, it winds up being a piece of this thing that changed America. But the book is very much just, what is this place? How did it come to be? How has it changed? And let me try and track that as much as possible.
And if I can hold these two books open to the page, not fall off my stool at the same time and ask a question, but it would make for the video version to be a nice little reel on Instagram later. You both say a little bit about this beautiful map or set of maps that you both use. Virginia, why don't you tell us a little bit about this very tiny version and what this is that we're looking at? Many
We
of you
love
know
the
this.
Harold Fisk maps.
The Harold Fisk map.
So, I mean, Boyce goes into much more depth about this in their book, so I feel like I want to defer to him. But I think just to talk about the representation and visually how that's something that is so reflective of both of our works, where it is meant to be shifting and changing over time. So obviously, those maps kind of chart the course of the Mississippi River.
Tell people, because some people may not know what the Fisk maps
We're
are.
like, okay, sorry.
Yeah, you're in it. You're in it.
I'm like, I see my landscape architecture friends. I'm like, oh, you know. So yeah, it charts the course of the Mississippi River over thousands of years, and kind of shows this really, really visually beautiful way of how the Mississippi River has naturally changed course, obviously before the creation of the levee system that kind of was put in place to hold it back. So actually, the graphic designers that worked on my book created the end papers that are a part of that map as well. So it's everywhere. You can't not see it now, wherever you go. But yeah, I think that just kind of getting to what we're talking about here that keeps coming up a lot is this shifting and meandering, and Boyce has done that beautifully in their book, just in terms of canoeing and actually experiencing the river, and thinking about the ways that the shifting and movement of water is so reflective in their work, but also in the book that I created, including about 17 different authors whose opinions and perspectives are sometimes in conflict with one another, as a way of kind of also meandering and thinking about how there isn't a singular way of reading this landscape, that there are multiple perspectives, and the multiplicity was a really important part of creating the book.
You want to talk about Fisk?
Yeah, briefly on Fisk. And I'll riff on also, so how meandering becomes important when you're doing work about the river or the delta. I think Virginia captured the history of the Fisk maps really well there. The thing that struck me is, like, I spent a lot of time looking at different cartographic representations of the river, and I tried, and it's going to be hard to see from here, but I tried to set the Fisk map just a few pages away from a different map, also created by the Army Corps of Engineers. Right, Fisk was a geologist working for the Army Corps in the 1940s. Crazy to me. This was like the first time, it was 100 plus years into the Army Corps' engineering. First time anyone was like, we should probably figure out what this river used to do over the past few thousand years. But then like 10 years later, they create this map that is, it shows the project design flood. So the the hypothetical disaster that our flood protection is designed to protect us from. And this is sort of shows how much water is going to come in for different tributaries, go out various distributaries and spillways and things like that. And those maps side by side from the same agency are just these wildly different ways of looking at this river as something that in its natural state changes and meanders and is ever changing, and versus something that we can sort of constrain and control and turn into a set of pipelines. And the Fisk maps are just part of their beauty to me is how rare it is to be able in a static set of documents capture change and that essential fact of the Mississippi River. But then I also, when Virginia was saying, like meandering through different voices, that's not the option I took in this book, but I did meander through time and there's a line at the beginning of the book where I say, like, I hope you'll forgive me, but this book isn't chronological because I have to wind like the river. And that was probably a little bit of an excuse for me I just like writing that way. But I also do think the river, the things that come up when you're talking about oil companies or engineering and all this, it collapses time in so many ways and you have to jump back and forth. And so there's something about this landscape that resists these very linear modes of telling and thinking.
Well, there you have it too. I mean, if the logic of the river the river, with all of these places that the river comes from and all the places that it floods out. You say at the end, in the epilogue or the last chapter of the book, that at this point, by the time the Mississippi River gets to its end, only 20% of the water that has been this massive amount that's flooding actually gets there. It's all flooding out in a different place. I want to come back to that in a moment, but I'm interested in the narrative part of it here too. So if we tell the history of this region or of America through the river, the multiplicitous river, it's a different form of American history too. Different dates become important to us. And I started writing down, we think about history told through wars, or history professors, or history told through great individuals, so to speak, that different dates become, or labor history. Here we have things like 1849, the Swamp Land Act, 1927, the Great Mississippi River Flood, 1928, the Flood Control Act, 1937, when the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers starts building this massive system of levees and dams that changes everything again too. It's a really, or 1803, Louisiana Purchase, a different version. So I'm interested because we're talking a lot about the field of environmental history, environmental humanities that's been emerging and that we're building here at Tulane quite, quickly and with great passion. But environmental history, your books would suggest, is also American history or global history in a different way too. So I like, I like the way that you're thinking about this as a narrative license in a sense. But how do you think about environmental history and American history? And then we're going to go to your thoughts on this too, Virginia.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. Interestingly, right, so I never took a single history course in college, right? I was very proud of my interdisciplinary nature and like dabbled in all this stuff, and had no interest in history in high school or college. And it was so, and now I feel like people are like, you are a historian. I was like, it's all secondary sources. I'm not really a historian, but I've had to wade deeply into history. And so, and that may be to my advantage of this. It's like I am not wedded to some of these standard classical big man or war narratives. The Civil War is almost not in this book at all, because to me, I was like, it's really important to the river story, but not to the shaping of the river. And so I just couldn't put it all in there. And so maybe I was freer to tell a different history. But one of the things that makes me think is like this, just again, my project is like, I want to understand where I am. And I was like, I better learn American history. And now I know it very well. And so it's been fun to have that, and it's been useful in this crazy, chaotic, troubled time to better understand American history. So I don't know if that answers that.
It does. I mean, and when you have a line there about Jefferson's description of New Orleans, it's not really around the time of the Louisiana Purchase, which was for the city of New Orleans that that Jefferson wanted, but in fact,
right.
So tell that.
In terms of him wanting to.
Yeah, New Orleans is not really a city for him. It's like a place that floods, and it's a little.
Oh yeah. There's a little line from one of his notes of like, basically he was trying to come up with a natural law as to why the United States should own New Orleans when it was still a Spanish territory, and he was basically like, because it's like barely even land, like it's water, and water should belong to the people who are upstream of the river. So basically, it's like New Orleans is part of the river, and the river is American mostly, so that should be us too. But I'm going to take it in a slightly different direction before we turn it.
It's an amazing quote, yeah.
Yeah, to Virginia. I mean, the other thing that I thought a lot about telling history through this river was my first inclination. Like, I'm not that interested in the big man history, right? And a lot of this book had to be looking at presidents and chief engineers, and like, because I wanted to track what we've done to the river. And so, but there's a moment late in the book where I get to this delta specifically, where I kind of like, there's a different book that I like wish I could have written that was the voices of the indigenous people, the runaway slaves, the Filipino immigrants that lived in this landscape, that were the only people at first paying attention to the wetlands and things like that. And so I have just like 2 or 3 pages where I kind of vaguely admit, like, there's this other story that I almost care more about, but that couldn't fit into the book, that it had to be constructed for this project. And that's one of the things I love about Virginia's book, is the way it gets all those voices in that it wasn't quite possible in what I was trying to do.
Virginia, when this book, which is your photographs, which of the river, I want to talk about those, and text by yourself and other authors, is again in a kind of line of books that also brings together words and images too. So when you were thinking about this book or putting this together, whom did you think you were in conversation with in those two directions? Yeah.
So this idea of history too, and thinking about a visual history of a place, and also architecturally for me, most of my work is based on architecture, infrastructure, landscape as a way of understanding human nature, how we interact with the earth, how we interact with each other. A huge influence for me, obviously, is Petrochemical America, which I don't know if everyone in this room has seen, but it was produced, I believe the first one came out in maybe 2011. All right, I'm looking at Liz again. Thank you. Which was a collaboration between Kate Orff, landscape architect, and Richard Misrock, who is a very famous landscape photographer. And in my early career, seeing a book like that as a way to bridge fine art and also the sciences, policy, a lot of the representations that Kate and her team produced chronicles kind of the history of the oil industry in Louisiana, and Richard's photographs kind of complement that. A lot of the work came out after the BP oil spill, but also traces a lot of the landscapes between here and Baton Rouge along the river and the refineries there. So that being just kind of a visual inspiration for me, and thinking about the ways that books can reach audiences who haven't really necessarily been involved in the subject matter before. It was really important for me as an artist that it wasn't necessarily a coffee table book per se, and there's certainly nothing wrong with that, but the way that I have always seen my practice and my photographs working is in tandem with the people that I'm learning from and collaborating with on the work itself. So it's an ongoing conversation between myself, the work, and so many of the people in Louisiana that I've had the opportunity to engage with in various ways.
So can you talk a little bit about your own process as a photographer, as an artist, and again, you're alluding to it, that tension between wanting to look at the photograph and engage with it as an aesthetic object, and whether it's in the essays or not, whether you want to call it the politics of it or other extra aesthetic questions that are happening.
So I come from the school that I kind of learned photography in. Stephen Shore, I don't know if anyone knows his work, but he's an American landscape architect who really just takes pictures of buildings that are just facade focused. A lot of people find them boring, but I found that work to be something that really allowed me to conceptualize and think about the issues around environmentalism, climate change, all of these things in the built form. So my practice focusing on architecture and infrastructure, I will visit sites over and over again, both as just kind of a meditative practice, but also in terms of seeing the ways that storms and weather really mark time. And we're talking about history and dates in this conversation. For me, kind of the process of this book was thinking about storms that really were significant in this region and the ways that policy changed after that, but also the ways that architecture also reflects how building styles and where and how we build is manifested. So I know that you keep looking at the triptych.
Yeah, we're going to talk about the triptych.
Okay,
yeah.
okay. I don't want to jump to it, sorry.
Oh, no, wait, one question before the triptych. And even the word triptych. My God. But so the choice to work in black and white can move in many directions. And I don't know about your other work and how you think about color, black and white, but can you talk about the choice to work in black and white for this book?
Yeah, it was something that was intentional. I mean, I have other projects and bodies of work that incorporate color and are very much about capturing a sense of the picturesque in this landscape and the ethereal beauty that exists here. I wanted to do this project specifically in black and white because so much of it is about form and kind of de-aestheticizing the place. A lot of the work is in conversation with kind of this visual narrative that we've constructed around climate change, and so much of that being focused on disaster imagery, kind of like this hyper sensation of looking at destruction after storms, and how so often we see in the media Louisiana, other places that are repeatedly struck by hurricanes and flooding, as like those are the iconic images that we associate with this landscape sometimes. And for me, I really wanted to kind of capture this more everyday, banal sense of the landscape and really highlight the ways that form and structure and the relationships between the natural and human engineered elements complement each other or don't.
You know, since I implicitly compared Boyce to Mark Twain, can I ask you just, and you might be upset with me, we didn't rehearse, so on purpose. You know, it also evokes for me Walker Evans' James Agee book, Let Us Now Praise Famous Men, and also the work of one of lesser known but American novelists, photographers that I love, Wright Morris, who also inexplicably both, you know, the photographs don't engage with the text. Obviously they're engaging with the text, but they're not captions, the text, right? Are these works worth holding on to, and they're also black and white photography? Is that going to upset you?
No.
I mean, no, because, right, I mean, you know, obviously Walker Evans and James Agee in their moment, the moment when a lot of these projects are happening on the levees, are also engaged in a political project. That's aesthetic.
Right.
Yeah.
And I mean, I think that, like I had said from the beginning, art is inherently political. It's subjective. And my subjectivity comes out in my photographs, and wanting to incorporate different perspectives and point of views in the book was really important to me. One of my favorite photographers is Robert Adams, and the title of the book actually comes from a quote of his from a show that he had at the Frankel Gallery in the early 2000s. But for those of you who don't know who he is, he's a photographer for decades, has chronicled the destruction of the American West and the forests in the American West. And his retrospective that he had at the National Gallery of Art a couple of years ago is actually called American Silence. So there's something that's very poetic and like spiritual in his work that is all black and white, very basic form, kind of de-aestheticized, that I find a lot of inspiration in, just as a way of sitting with the pictures and being able to read multiple stories into that. You know, they're not meant to be pictures that are just standalone. They require context, and there are multiple histories that are present in that.
Great. Last minute that we have here on this very tight schedule that we keep to let you on to your next panels. Boyce, what's of the many takeaways, what's one thing that the folks who haven't yet read the book before they rush over to go buy it and then start reading it and spending the rest of their weekend doing it, which they should, you want folks to know about the Mississippi River that they didn't come in here knowing?
I mean, I don't want to presume what people did or did not know or think. And like, I think this audience probably has more people that already know the Mississippi River is beautiful. That is one of them. It's just like, I think I talk a lot. I've been talking on the book tour, like we need to have a Mississippi River National Park. That would change the story of the river. But one of the takeaways, one of the ideas that always sticks with me is that I talk about the Mississippi River being wild, but it's also very much not wild in that the lower Mississippi River, we know humans have lived here for at least 12,000 years, which is basically as long as the river has acted the way it acts. And so there's always been this human presence, and that's been really important to my understanding of the river. In my reading of indigenous history, I came to think that this delta where we're sitting was probably the most spiritually important place in North America for many thousands of years, and I think that's something we should pay attention to and remember. So.
Oh, and that spiritual aspect, and we won't discuss it because we don't have the work on the thing, but the triptych of what is called the Great Wall of Louisiana that Virginia depicts, and we'll go take a look at. We'll rush out and go look at the images out in the hallway. Is also a spiritual aspect there, right? Yeah. Do you want the last word? Yeah.
Oh gosh. Well, thanks you. Yeah. The triptych. What can I say about that? It's a triptych of the Great Wall of Louisiana, the nickname for the lake-borne storm surge barrier. But I think that it really reflects this fragmentation that we have in Louisiana across politics, across race, across geography. That was a really great representation. And Andy Horowitz, the amazing writer who wrote Katrina a couple years ago, wrote the essay for that really talks about kind of the history of the Mr. Go and the opening and closing of that. So it's one of my favorite pieces in the book. I'm biased, but I think that it does such an amazing job of talking about kind of these conflicting perspectives and the diversity of views that we hold here, but it also really represents kind of how we make meaning with each other.
Well, this has been a really wonderful conversation. You're in conversation with artists, with history, with the nature, and with American history, and with each other. And so rush out and get these books and read them. But in the meantime, join me in thanking Boyce Upholt and Virginia Hanusik.
Thank you.